The Kentucky Wildcats landed one of the top transfer quarterbacks out of the transfer portal in Zach Calzada from Incarnate Word, previously a quarterback for Texas A&M before transferring to Incarnate Word. And I do think that Calzada is going to leave a pretty solid Kentucky offense. The defense also not going to be terrible, but they have a really tough schedule, so making a bowl game is still going to be an uphill battle for this Kentucky team that finished near the bottom of the conference last season. They started off the year with a matchup against Toledo, one of the better teams in the MAC. We saw Toledo beat multiple Power Four teams last year, including an SEC school in Mississippi State, before beating Pitt in their bowl game. I think this Toledo team's still going to be pretty decent, but I trust Calzada in his first game as a Wildcat to pull off the win before a matchup with Ole Miss in an early SEC game.
And Ole Miss is going to have revenge on their mind considering that Kentucky beat them on the road last year. But Ole Miss is going to look a lot different from that team last year. Jackson Dart has finally moved on from the program after being the backbone of the offense for the past few years, along with numerous other key players like Trey Harris, the wide receiver position, along with many defensive players. So this Ole Miss team has a lot to rebuild, but they do have Austin Simmons coming in to be their starting quarterback. He was with the team last year and played in some backup roles or against some lesser opponents. But this is going to be his first real year where he is the starter for the Rebels. And I think it's going to be a lot for him to adjust to, especially with his second ever start being against an SEC team on the road. And we saw Kentucky's got a decent home field atmosphere, giving Georgia, of all teams, a scare last season. Granted, the Bulldogs did come out with a win, but that was a much closer game than most people were expecting. So this game can get pretty close, especially with Zach Calzada being the starting quarterback. But there's just a lot that this Kentucky team has to replace and figure out. The defense has lost a lot of their defensive line and their linebackers. The secondary is still pretty decent, but they're only bringing in three transfer starters on that defensive line that I think will take some time to get going early on in this season. So I do think Lane Kiffin is going to have a good game plan to handle Kentucky here and get some revenge. So Ole Miss will get the win, dropping Kentucky to 1-1, but they will get back in the win column hosting Eastern Michigan the following week. Not really too much competition there. It is just an SEC team against a group of five teams. So they will be 2-1 going into their first bye week.
And after that, a really difficult two-game stretch going against two of the best teams in the SEC and both on the road. The first one is the South Carolina Gamecocks. They have Lenoris Sellers returning at the quarterback position after a pretty impressive season last year. He's one of the favorites for the Heisman Trophy this season. And I think South Carolina is bound to have a very successful season. They have just a lot of last year's team coming back and they did very well last season. Arguably should have made the college football playoffs. You had that game against LSU where there was a controversial call, the close finish against Alabama. South Carolina very easily could have been 11-1 last season. This year, I think they're going to be very good once again. Unfortunately for Kentucky, the Gamecocks are going to be the better team. They lost a little bit on the defensive line, but they should be able to replace that. And by this point, I do think they're going to be playing very well, especially defensively. They'll get some pressure on Calzada, and they will get this win. And then it's a matchup with the Georgia Bulldogs. Another very difficult game. Georgia's going to be a really good team once again. Gunnar Stockton back at quarterback after taking over for Carson Beck late in the season last year. And I think Stockton's going to have a pretty solid year for Georgia, even though they might not be quite as good as we've seen in past years. This is still a very scary team. They're going to have one of the top defenses in the country, no doubt. They'll slow down this Kentucky offense. And even though it was a very close game last season, I do think that Georgia will once again get this win. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was by a little bit more than just 7 points this year either.
Coming out of that bye week and that tough two-game stretch, it doesn't get much easier. Hosting the Texas Longhorns, the early favorite to be the next college football champion. And that is coming on the back of Arch Manning stepping into the starting quarterback job after he backed up Quinn Ewers and actually was the starter for a couple games while Ewers was dealing with an injury. But if he's able to play to the level that a lot of people are hyping him up to be, then this Texas offense is going to be scary with the amount of production they have returning and the amount of transfers they have coming in. Not to mention on the defense, they have some of the best defensive players in the country, especially in that secondary. Steve Sarkisian is a mastermind and is going to have this Texas team vying for an SEC title, finally hoping to get over the hump and beat Georgia. We will have to see how that goes during this season. But against Kentucky, yes, Kentucky played Georgia close last year, like we've already mentioned, but I think Texas is just a completely different animal than Georgia. Georgia has been a little bit weaker in the past few years. They've been very, very good, don't get me wrong, but compared to the dynasty they had going several years ago, it's not necessarily the same level of dominance. Texas, on the other hand, is looking like they're surging and going to take that crown for the top team in the SEC for the next few years. I think Kentucky will stand no chance against the Longhorns, dropping Kentucky to 2-4. And then they host Tennessee, and Tennessee is going to be an interesting team this season. Obviously, there was the fallout with Nico Imalava now being a UCLA Bruin after wanting more NIL money from the Volunteers. And instead of having Nico this season, they now have Joey Aguilar, who was the UCLA quarterback last season. And he can be serviceable and does have starting experience, which is a bonus. But the amount of weapons Tennessee has lost from last season is a little bit concerning, especially in the wide receiver room. Now, they have plenty of talented guys filling those spots, but considering they are a little bit younger and are not dealing with a returning quarterback from the program last year, it's going to be a little bit hard to build those connections. They lost Dylan Sampson, who was the starting running back last season, and defensively, they have some good players, but losing their star edge rusher in James Pierce Jr. is going to hurt the pass rush a little bit. And some of the key players in the secondary, such as Boo Carter, haven't been seen as much during the opening training camps leading up to the start of the season. So Tennessee's got some issues to figure out. Meanwhile, Kentucky, I think, is going to be in a great spot going into this season, and I think this is where we can see Zach Calzada step it up, with Tennessee being on a little bit of a downswing and Kentucky finally having an offense that seems very good. They also have Dante Dowdle coming in from Nebraska to be the starting running back, not to mention having their lead running back from last year returning in Jamarian Wilcox, who has slid down the depth chart a little bit, but still going to be a valuable addition to this team. Overall, I think this is where we can see Kentucky get a win in the SEC against a struggling Tennessee team. So they will move to 3-4.
And then they'll face the Auburn Tigers. This is a team that a lot of people think are going to be much improved this season. They brought in Oklahoma transfer quarterback Jackson Arnold to be the starter. And I think Auburn's going to have a pretty solid season, although not quite as good as their fans are hoping. Some people think they can compete for an SEC title, potentially a college football playoff berth. I don't see that happening. I think the ceiling's probably going to be around, somewhere between 7 and 9 wins. They have the ability to beat Alabama this season. I think that is certainly a possibility. And against this Kentucky team, I do think the Wildcats will be able to make it close. I think by this point, the offense is going to be very solid. They've played some very tough teams up to this point. So, really, Auburn's one of the easiest games that they've had over this stretch since September 13th, other than Tennessee. So Kentucky definitely can make this game close, but after finally winning their first SEC game the week before, I do think that on the road, especially, Kentucky is going to drop this one and fall to 3-5. And then it's the Florida Gators. This is a team that we are very high on this season. We particularly like DJ Lagway. I think he has a lot of potential this season. The Gators all around are going to be a really good team, and they can compete with some of the top teams in the SEC. We saw it last year when they almost beat Georgia before DJ Lagway got injured. This Florida team this season should be one of the best teams in the conference, and I do think that they are better than Kentucky. They're going to get this win at home, but luckily for Kentucky, they have their prototypical SEC FCS matchup. They'll play Tennessee Tech and get a win to move to 4 wins.
And much like they had to deal with the 2 games in between their bye weeks, they have back-to-back road trips to end the season. And it starts with a road trip to Vandy. And the Commodores are going to be an interesting team next year, but unlike Tennessee, they have a lot returning, including starting quarterback Diego Pavia, who is coming off of a very, very successful season by his standards and has been talking quite a lot in this offseason about the expectations for Vanderbilt and who they want to compete against. And is that going to happen? Who knows? But I like the fire from Pavia, and I think offensively, it's going to be a little interesting. He does have his lead receiver returning in Eli Stowers at the tight end position, who's going to be one of the best tight ends in college football going into next season. The wide receiver room isn't as strong as you would like it to be, but serviceable. But the real star for this Vandy team and why I think they will be pretty sneaky good is how much returning production they have on their defense from last year. And their defense might not have been one of the best in the SEC last year, but with that amount of starting production returning from last season's defense, they can make so many strides forward with this core that they have returning that this defense can go from being mediocre or just average to being a very, very good defense and can compete with some of these offenses that they will face in the SEC. It will be a tough battle against Kentucky with the offense that they have, but I think when you compare the Vandy offense to the Kentucky defense, Vandy will be able to take advantage of the defensive pressure that might be lacking at times. So I think Vandy will be able to protect the home field here and get the win, dropping Kentucky to 4-7. And then they have their in-state rivalry game against Louisville. And Louisville is going to be a very good team next season. They have Isaac Brown returning as their starting running back after an incredible freshman year. Going to be one of the best running backs in all of college football going into next season. They do have to replace Tyler Shuff as their starting quarterback as he is now in the NFL. And they brought in Miller Moss from USC. And Miller Moss had his ups and downs as a Trojan. The highs were very good and he looked like a very, very good quarterback, but the lows were very noticeable. And that's why I do think USC made a somewhat right choice in moving on or letting Miller Moss seek out another team and going with Jordan Mailata. I think Jordan Mailata does a lot of the same things that Miller Moss does, but Miller Moss is still going to be a good quarterback, a serviceable one for Louisville. And I think the Cardinals overall are looking like one of the dark horse teams in the ACC. Granted, Clemson is going to be the juggernaut they have to face, but coming off of a win at Death Valley last season, getting to play Clemson at home this year, Louisville might be in contention for an ACC title. But since this is a rivalry game, I do think there is some gray area where Kentucky might be able to pull off an upset, especially on the road after playing such a difficult schedule, kind of spoiling Louisville's season. But overall, I do think the weapons this Louisville team has are going to be able to handle the defense that Kentucky will bring to the table. And offensively, Kentucky might be able to stay in it for a little bit, but at the end of the day, Louisville is the more complete team, the better team overall, the home team in this one. The Cardinals are going to get the win, dropping Kentucky to 4-8. And while that might be a pretty disappointing record considering how good this offense can be, I do think Kentucky will be a much more competitive team than we saw them the past few years, building off some of their success from last season, like that win over Ole Miss and like that close game against Georgia.
Our way too early prediction for the Wildcats was 4.3 wins, and we only had them going 3-9. We got them an SEC win since that point and brought them up to 4-8. The projection is at 4.9 wins, 1.75 and 6.25 in conference play. They really did get a very tough conference schedule, but we think their ceiling could be as high as 7-5. And that's just if a few of these close games go the other way. I talked about that Auburn won a decent amount. That's certainly a game that Kentucky could win. They could pull off the upset against Louisville. They could beat Vanderbilt. There's a few different games that Kentucky has the ability to win. It's not even mentioning Ole Miss, who they beat last season, or Georgia, who they almost beat last season. But the floor, they could go winless in the SEC it's very possible. It's just a tough schedule. If Tennessee turns out to be a little bit better than we think that they're going to be, I think that there won't be a single SEC game Kentucky is actually favored in. So there is a possibility the Wildcats go 3-9. But for right now, we have them at 4-8 with the potential to make a bowl game if they can win a couple of those close games. So thank you guys for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in our next video.